Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Todd Sechser. I'm a professor in the Politics Department and a senior fellow here at the Miller Center, as well as the director of the new Democratic Statecraft Lab within the Democracy Initiative. My area of expertise is in nuclear weapons policy and international security, and the last several years have been, in a morbid sort of way, a period of abundance for people in my line of work. We saw the United States negotiate, sign, and then abruptly withdraw from an agreement with Iran that was designed to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. We engaged in some very tense diplomacy with North Korea over its nuclear program, before then holding a summit in which the two countries agreed, at least in principle, to denuclearize at some point in the future the Korean Peninsula. And then the United States and Russia terminated one of the Cold War's most important arms control agreements, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And all of this is, of course, taking place against a backdrop of renewed and expanded investment in America's nuclear arsenal. Plans are underway as we speak for the Department of Defense to spend more than $1 trillion over 30 years building new nuclear missile submarines, new bombers, new ballistic missiles. And just this month, of course, the Defense Department announced that it had deployed a new nuclear warhead on U.S. ballistic missile submarines. Leon Trotsky once famously said that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I think something similar perhaps could be said about nuclear weapons today. A quarter century after the end of the Cold War, we're still trying to resolve very basic questions about the role of nuclear weapons in international politics. Few of us, I think, would dispute the importance of nuclear weapons. And indeed, the advent of nuclear weapons is considered so important that geologists have now decided to designate a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene era, which begins with the invention of nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons are thought to mark not just the beginning of a new era in international politics, but in fact an entirely new geological era. But what we don't yet fully understand is the effect of nuclear weapons in international relations. There are aspects of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union that we're still trying to come to grips with, and whose lessons carry very important implications for how we think about the rise of geopolitical competition with Russia and China today. To help us resolve some of these critical questions, we are very fortunate today to have one of the country's most talented scholars in the field of nuclear security. And I should add, a former recipient of a Miller Center Fellowship. And that is Brendan Green, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati. He is an expert on US foreign policy, military doctrine, and especially for our purposes today, the role of nuclear weapons in international politics. He has a long list of publications to his name. He was a co-editor of the book US Military Innovation Since the Cold War. He is the author of a variety of influential academic articles in journals such as International Security, Security Studies, the Journal of Strategic Studies, and a number of other publications. Several of his articles, I should note, have won very prestigious awards. And for good reason. They have reshaped the way that scholars like me think about how nuclear weapons function in international relations and the role that they play not only today but throughout the nuclear age. And so I'm especially excited that he has just published this book, The Revolution That Failed, Nuclear Competition, Arms Control, and the Cold War. And I understand I'm owning what amounts to effectively a very rare baseball card, in that this is one of the few copies in existence within the United States right now, soon to be available only in the United Kingdom, at least for the next several weeks, published by Cambridge University Press. So Brendan is here today to talk to us about the research that he did in writing this book and the lessons that it carries for us in thinking about nuclear politics today. So please welcome Dr. Brendan Green. Thanks.
Thank you, Todd. Todd, if you ever get tired of your day job, you can be my press agent. That was a tremendous introduction. I'm deeply grateful and profoundly privileged to be here today. A decade ago, I had a fellowship at the Miller Center. It was one of the things that launched my career. I believe this is to be one of the preeminent places in the United States where scholars can talk to the educated public about issues of public importance. And so I'm very grateful for you all to come out today. I hope that it's worth the price of admission. I like to start these things off at a kind of basic level to make sure that we're all on the same page. A nuclear explosion will really ruin your day. What a nuclear weapon does is it compresses matter at very high temperatures and pressures and bombards it with neutrons until it releases a large amount of energy. But that's a kind of bloodless physics description. Physicists get to use the word large for stuff that I would call extraordinarily ginormous, or small for unfathomably tiny. So I like to give a sort of sense of what's happening with these weapons when they go off. And I think there are two ways to get a more tangible feel for the power of nuclear weapons. One is through Albert Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. That is the equivalence between mass and energy. The speed of light is an incredibly large number, right? When you multiply it by itself, it grows enormously, exponentially in the number of digits that it has. And what that implies is that even a very small amount of matter has within it a truly tremendous energy potential. And what nuclear weapons do is they convert some of that matter into energy. The second, I think, more visceral way to understanding this is that what happens inside a thermonuclear weapon, the most important and distinctive process, several processes happen, is what happens inside of stars. And so when you set off a nuclear weapon, what you're doing is you're bringing a tiny star to Earth. So consider just very briefly the effects of a 1 megaton nuclear detonation, which is admittedly a relatively large detonation. This would produce enough pressure to crush a railroad car and throw it like an old soda can for a distance of 4 miles. It would produce winds from 500 to 700 miles per hour, which is 3 to 5 times as hard as a hurricane. It would set everything within a mile of the weapon totally on fire. And that would probably, very likely, quickly develop into an enormous mass fire, which is a fire that has its own weather system and burns until everything within its radius is completely charred to a crisp. Or, that's if you detonated the weapon in the air. If you detonated it close to the ground, what it could do is destroy a heavily hardened bunker, potentially one built into the side of a mountain. And it would produce with it a cloud of radioactive debris that could spread for hundreds of miles and kill millions of people, depending on how the wind was blowing. In short, it doesn't take a whole lot of these weapons to destroy a society to the point where it's never coming back. Maybe a couple hundred of them if you were really conservative about it and you were really thorough about the kind of job that you needed to threaten to do. And so the puzzle that my book tries to understand is, after states have gotten enough nuclear weapons to blow the world up 3 or 4 times, let's say, why would they keep building them? And Indeed, I think the best kind of explanation that's out there that we have for how nuclear weapons might shape political relations in international politics, which has various names, but we might call the theory of the nuclear revolution, or more commonly, I think, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This sort of idea about how nuclear weapons work says they shouldn't keep building them. Once you have that kind of destructive power, it makes no sense to do this anymore. States should stop at a certain point. Indeed, what this idea basically says is that once each side has what's known as a secure second strike capability, that is, enough nuclear capability that you could absorb a preemptive attack and retaliate with a society-destroying response. At that point, no one can win a nuclear war. I mean, it's sort of kind of baroque and horrifying to think about winning any kind of nuclear war, but you could at least imagine before a certain point that someone might limp out of the war and someone else might not. But once both sides have this capability, then no one can win, and that means that neither side can be stronger than one another anymore. And that means that no state can get the bargaining advantages in a crisis or in some other sort of international negotiation that comes with being the strongest state. And so the incentive to build more of these weapons, to invest more in this kind of competition, once both sides have enough, disappears. You can't get anything else out of further investment in nuclear weapons. Or so this understanding of MAD tells us. The puzzle is, why didn't either of the superpowers believe this little story during the Cold War? And it was in fact after the Soviet Union finally obtained a secure second strike capability, which probably happened in the mid-50s, or mid-60s, I'm sorry. It was just a few years shortly after this, that the most intense phase of the Cold War nuclear arms competition began. Each side began to invest heavily in counterforce technologies, which are technologies that will allow your nuclear weapons to destroy the other guy's nuclear weapons. And occasionally in defensive technologies to protect its own population. And MAD says these are worthless investments, right? If you can't disarm the other guy's nuclear weapons, what's going to come back at you, you might be able to affect it on the margins, but it's going to be so horrifying that you won't ever think about doing anything that was that risky. Both sides, not only did both sides invest in that kind of technology, both sides developed elaborate and baroque nuclear doctrines and war plans. These were plans that were based on fighting and winning a global, protracted war that integrated nuclear weapons with conventional operations, the way that you would integrate artillery with tank maneuvers, right? They used to call these nuclear fires, right, to help conventional maneuver. And MAD regards this behavior as not only impossible to achieve, but in fact utterly insane, right? Which is, this kind of war doesn't make any sense. It's the kind of war that would tear apart the globe. Why spend all this effort planning for it, developing capabilities for it? And perhaps most surprisingly, the superpowers did all of this while investing countless man-hours in nuclear arms control, which dominated the international agenda in the 1970s, and which was at least nominally aimed at halting the competition that the two sides were waging against one another. And MAD would argue it should be very easy to get a deal that would stop this competition and maybe even dramatically ratchet it back. But with one potentially important exception, Cold War arms control never amounted to very much. It's sort of, I like to call it the Seinfeld of great power politics, which is, it was a wildly popular show about nothing, right? Now, that's not entirely fair, and I'll explain some of what I think was going on. But the point is this is really surprising behavior based on the kind of, I think, intuitive understanding of nuclear weapons that you develop once you start to learn about just how destructive these weapons are. And to the extent that people have an explanation for this behavior, it's always been one that's rooted in pathological domestic politics. It's an explanation that says, look, there were rational statesmen at the top of societies in both superpowers. They looked at this problem. They knew the arms race was sort of dumb, but they got driven into it because of domestic things going on inside their society. Military-industrial complexes on the loose, right? Bureaucracies that had their own interest, that were pushing for what was good for their organization rather than what was good for the nation at a whole. Electoral politics in the democracy of the United States, various different Politburo contrivings in the Soviet Union. But the basic explanation that's out there is that this was something that the leaders of states were forced into and that they would have preferred to avoid if they could have done. In contrast, the argument of my book is that at least on the American side, which is what I had the most data to examine and what the cases I use focus on, domestic pathologies didn't drive the arms race. In fact, they were much more likely to put a brake on it at different points. The engine of the arms race was the choices of American leaders. And American leaders were basically rational statesmen who thought that they were getting something out of the race. And so I would just say to you, you ought to want to know who's right about this question, right? Whether my explanation is right or whether the kind of traditional domestic pathological explanation is right. Because the United States looks like it is re-entering a period of intense great power competition with the Russians and the Chinese. And this is already a military competition, and it already has important nuclear elements as part of that competition. And if world politics heats up, as it might, we could see an extraordinarily competitive nuclear environment again. Moreover, nuclear weapons have proliferated since the middle of the Cold War. And there are now several possible nuclear competitions that don't involve the United States. Perhaps the most significant of them would be the triangle between China, India, and Pakistan in South Asia. And so these issues of when and how does competition happen are going to matter for more than just American policy. They're going to matter for the policy of lots of different important states. And finally, of all the major different strategic alternatives that have been offered in American debate for American foreign policy and the kind of commitments the United States should have towards the world, all of them have a story about nuclear weapons in them. But virtually none of them say either of two things, which is one, nuclear arms races are prone to fierce competition and are likely to develop in the future, or two, the United States is prone to wild overreactions in its domestic politics towards the problem of nuclear weapons. And so the issue of nuclear weapons, I think, is dealt with in only a cursory fashion in our debate about what kind of strategy the United States should have toward the world. We should want to get that right. We should want to understand how these weapons shape our policy. So, why did the United States compete so ferociously over nuclear weapons in the last half of the Cold War? Well, I'm going to give you basically 4 reasons about the story of American competition. But I want to start with a kind of baseline assumption, which is that even if both superpowers know that no one could get into a nuclear war and win it, and know that the other side knows that, you could still have an important crisis. And that crisis could go badly wrong, even if nobody wants it to go wrong. Think of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right? Think of the close calls that you might know about from that crisis. There's a wonderful movie, 13 Days, which dramatizes it. Right? But there were a number of places where if the Russians had interpreted the mistakes of the United States in the wrong way, it could have launched a global conflagration. Think of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, right? Where the superpowers end up trading nuclear threats with each other to try and get a hold of each other's proxies. I think most importantly of the 1989 peaceful revolutions in Europe and the way they could have gone bad. The great fear at the end of the Cold War was that you would see something like 1989, except that it wouldn't be peaceful, and the Russians wouldn't let their empire go, and that there would be some kind of disturbance in the eastern half of Germany that the western half of Germany was not willing to tolerate. And suddenly, even though both superpowers wanted to stay at arm's length, they were dragged into a crisis about the most important thing in the Cold War, which was the status of Germany. So these crises could have gone to very dark places, just by accidents that could happen in a crisis, but even more importantly, the belief that the other side might be getting ready to strike. And so, in that kind of environment, the state that's likely to get most of what it wants is the state that's willing to take risks, that's willing to be bold, that's willing to manipulate its military forces in dangerous ways, that shows the adversary how resolved it is. And that's the kind of state that's more likely to get its opponent to stand down, or at least negotiate an acceptable end to such a crisis. And so the question that every state is asking, even if they believe that nuclear weapons are these stabilizing forces that no one could ever use, is how are we going to get out of the crisis that we didn't want to get into? Right? So that's the baseline assumption. So here are the first two of my answers about why the United States competed so fiercely have to do with that assumption, which is point number one. What if states think they're close to being able to disarm the other guy? That is, if you think that your society might be able to survive a nuclear war, brutalized, broken, but alive, and the other side couldn't, that would give you a reason to take risks, and the other side reason to back down. And to most analysts, this is sort of an absurd proposition. With thousands of nuclear weapons on each side, tolerable pain, how could it make sense to think about trying to disarm the other guy? Why would you ever want to try to invest anything into this Don Quixote-like task that's just impossible? As it turns out, the United States was extraordinarily good at this. By the end of the where only sound can give away where things are, where light doesn't penetrate, where the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum doesn't penetrate beyond a couple hundred feet. The Soviet submarine force was highly vulnerable to trailing by American attack submarines. Have you seen The Hunt for Red October? That was basically true. Not as an actual fictional story, but as the technological capabilities go, it's basically a true story. And at important points in the Cold War, every Soviet missile submarine deployed at sea had a little American friend off of its stern who was just waiting for signs that things were ready to go bad. So the US part of the competition was pushing ever closer to a situation where in an extreme crisis, a disarming strike might seem like a sporting proposition rather than utter insanity. And that would be the type of thing that would allow the United States, potentially, to act boldly and take more risks in a crisis, and therefore have a greater probability of surviving that crisis with its basic values intact. And that gave Washington an incentive for the arms race, if for no other reason than to deny a similar capability to the Soviets, which is even if we raced each other and didn't get very far, it would at least resolve the problem of the Soviets doing it to us, right? Point number two. What if the other guy doesn't understand that winning the nuclear war is impossible? During the Cold War, there were elements, I think, on both sides of the East-West divide who would often talk as though fighting and winning a nuclear war was something that could be done the way that you did conventional war. And in one famous conversation, a US Air Force general told an analyst who had asked what winning a nuclear war would mean that, quote, if at the end there is one Russian and two Americans left, we win. To which the analyst replied, you had better hope they are one man and one woman. Right? And indeed, during the Cold War, large elements of the Soviet military, though not, I should note, generally Soviet politicians, but large elements of their military used to talk and write with assumptions like this, that a nuclear war could make sense. And these beliefs sort of sound absurd, but the absurdity gives you a paradoxical advantage, which is that if the Soviets falsely believe that they could win a nuclear war, that would give them reason to take risks in a crisis. And if the United States correctly believes that no one could win, that would give the United States reasons to back down in a crisis and to make potentially damaging compromises. Thus, the US and its leaders often believed that they had incentives to prove that it could measure up to a crazy set of Russian beliefs, which is that even under standards that we don't accept, we want to convince you that we could do well in the scenarios you're envisioning. And this is where many of the crazy Byzantine plans and sort of Baroque doctrines came from. Point number 3 has nothing to do with a crisis, which is that doing better at this competition, which you're engaged in because at a bottom level you fear a crisis, might provide you with peacetime benefits. If nothing else, it's going to make the other side very hesitant to get into a crisis with you, which is this kind of competition makes the nuclear balance uncertain. Look at what the other guy is doing. How well could he do? Does he know things that I don't know? Best to be calm and stay back until we have a handle on the arms race. Second of all, it could divert the other side's defense resources. All the money that the Soviet Union spends trying to protect its nuclear weapons are not money that it's spending in Central Europe, where it could threaten to roll its tanks over or through the Fulda Gap. Third, you can force the other side to adjust its diplomacy and strategy. If you're not doing well in the arms race, that gives you incentives to try to bargain your way out of it. And then finally, the United States went into this competition deeply concerned with its allies. And indeed, the state of political relationships in Europe was, in one sense, the very object of the Cold War. But our allies live in this terrible world where they have to count on someone else to save them at the moment of truth. And so competing vigorously against the Soviet Union is potentially a way to reassure them and make your life in the NATO alliance easier and more simple to manage. Final point, point 4. What was arms control about then? So contrary to publicly proclaimed intentions, I think arms control in the 1970s and 1980s was largely not about halting or ratcheting back the nuclear competition. It was actually a way of managing that competition so that it emphasized American strengths and highlighted Soviet weaknesses. And the key thing to remember is that the context of this is the Vietnam War. And during the 1970s, American leaders were terrified that the American people and their congressional representatives lacked the will to continue to compete against the Soviet Union, that it would be too expensive, or that in the wake of Vietnam, they would simply accept the mad view that nuclear competition was unnecessary, even though there were these important reasons it needed to be pursued. And arms control, in their view, was the essential domestic political component of a competitive strategy. It convinced Congress to pony up for nuclear competition because nuclear programs were the only thing that could get it a good deal at the arms control table. At the same time, the restrictions that were agreed in the SALT treaties during this process favored the United States. They put a hard cap on the total number of missiles, and the sheer industrial production capability was the great Soviet advantage that they had in military competition. When it came time to churn something out, things could come out of the Soviet Union like sausages, right? But it left the qualitative competition and technological innovation, the great American strength, completely unrestricted. And that was where American advantages could be exploited. I think, incidentally, for their part, the Soviets were not dumb. They sort of understood this was happening, but they had another fear, which was the fear was that American decision makers were wrong about their society. And they had seen in World War II what happens when you release the American economy solely upon industrial production. And they feared that coming about again. And so they had reasons themselves to engage in this kind of negotiation. Overall, though, I would say that the SALT deals basically favored the United States and helped the nuclear competition continue, but under more favorable terms for Washington. All right, I'll conclude now with simply what does this all mean for today? Well, I hope very much nothing at all. I should like nothing better than for my career to be entirely irrelevant. For 20 years after the Cold War, we saw a pretty quiescent international environment, and maybe we'll be able to head back to it. But in truth, I'm not optimistic. The past decade has seen a terrific worsening of relations between the United States and China and the United States and Russia. Indo-Pakistani relations today appear to be heating up as well. Elements of nuclear competition are starting to emerge in both dyads. So my first point would be, strap in. It looks to me like we may be headed for a very competitive nuclear future, and possibly Cold War II, the sequel, if things get really bad. Second point, we need to think about what this competition ought to look like if it occurs. It would be nice, if we could, to avoid the craziest parts of what happened in the Cold War. I believe I've basically made the argument that the statesmen involved were rational. They had at least plausible reasons for doing the things they wanted to do. But some of these war plans, some of these visions of a global protracted war, I think they were intensely damaging, and there might have been other potential ways to deal with the problem of perceptions. So we should consider, if we end up in a competition, and I'm not totally sanguine about such a competition, but we might have to accept it, the technological competition is the American strength. We shouldn't get into a competition about the crazy stories we can tell each other. That's very dangerous. And third, the final point would be, whatever your views on this competition, if it occurs, you should think about the relationship between the arms race and arms control. And that relationship is paradoxical. In the past, at least, arms control has been the fundamental pillar on which nuclear competition rested. This repeated itself recently with the New START agreement, a treaty that Obama struck with Russia in 2009 in return for a massive, domestically in return for a massive modernization of the US arsenal. And so if you don't like the idea of this arms race that I think might be coming, you should be wary and skeptical of arms control. This is the tool on which the arms race has been founded in the past. Even though it seems, and it seems to me, in the abstract, like a stable, peace-loving, restrained kind of international activity. Meanwhile, if you fancy yourself a harder-edged person, someone who understands the realities of international political life, who thinks international military competition is sometimes necessary, you should be more open to arms control, even though it's the sort of thing that dirty hippies like. So thank you very much.
Brendan, thank you. Enlightening as always. Brendan has been writing for several years now, many years, about the history of nuclear competition in the Cold War and discoveries that he has made in the archives, discoveries like the fact that US submarines were able to not just locate but also track Soviet ballistic missile submarines during a period in the 1970s is the kind of discovery that for people like me makes the hairs on the back of our necks stick up because it undermines and calls into question some of the core foundations of what we believe about how nuclear deterrence operates in the world. I'd like to talk a little bit about your research in writing the book, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how you concluded and the implications for your historical research for what we should think about U.S. competition with Russia and China today.
Absolutely.
And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So please, as we discuss, please be thinking of questions that you would like to ask. But let's start with some of the research that you conducted in writing this book. In your book, you write about, or you focus on the period from 1969 to 1979. Yeah. So covering 3 presidential administrations, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Tell us a little bit about how this nuclear competition and these beliefs about the value of competing with the Soviet Union played out in some of these presidential administrations.
Absolutely. So the story really kicks off when Richard Nixon comes into office. And he has basically a giant domestic and international political problem of what do we do about Vietnam, right? And so he's trying to manage the fallout of this. And one of the key aspects that he has to think about is how do I keep the Soviet Union from exploiting the American weaknesses that have grown up from Vietnam? Right? And so this is what initially gets him interested in arms control, right? Which is it's a way of building a period of détente, which for Nixon and his consigliere, Henry Kissinger, is I think basically about getting America breathing space. But what he discovers as he goes about trying to negotiate this deal is that he can't get the kind of easy sort of cosmetic deal that he wants from the Soviets, and that he can't get his domestic public to be satisfied by it. And so what he eventually realizes is that some of the programs he's pursuing, like an ABM system, right, which was one of the big military programs at the time, which wasn't working very well in technical terms but might have promise for the future, it was better to trade that away because it got you something with both the Soviets and with Congress, right, which is it got you something with the Soviets, which is the Soviets feared American missile defense capabilities. They sort of, after watching the past 20 years, had come to regard American engineers as kind of wizards, right? And so they desperately wanted to get this off the table, while at the same time, all of the people in Congress who didn't want to fund the thing anyway were willing to put more money in the nuclear budget for other stuff if you could get a deal. Right? And so that was sort of the origins of the first great deal, which takes place in 1971. Eventually, the treaties are signed in 1972. The second thing I would highlight is the administration of Jimmy Carter, right? Which is that Ford and Nixon are sort of a piece. The competition looks the same with them. But Carter's really an interesting wild card, right? And he is the standout administration in the whole Cold War in terms of thinking about nuclear weapons, which is Jimmy Carter despised these weapons, right, to the very core of his soul. And not only, I think many presidents did, Ronald Reagan particularly had bad thoughts about these weapons, but from day one, Carter was committed to using arms control to deal with the nuclear problem and the problem of détente more broadly. And so very early in his administration, he makes this very ambitious arms control offer for SALT II, the follow-on to the SALT I Accord, that is going to ratchet back the number of nuclear weapons, and importantly, it's going to give away some of these technological innovations. But he's sort of, he's not the most politically competent sort of administration in the world, right? There are interesting parallels here that we might pursue.
What?
Well, you know, I couldn't possibly comment, right? But I'll just say that this does not go well with the Soviets, right? And essentially, Carter is shocked at the response. He thought he was bringing them an open-hearted kind of, let's really get rid of this problem. And they saw him maneuvering for advantage, right? And so over the next few months, Carter starts to pay attention to his intelligence system. And he discovers, to his horror, that the Soviets don't think about nuclear weapons the way that he does, that they don't accept MAD, that, you know, he regarded Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon's arms control as cosmetic. It didn't even cut the number of weapons, right? Whereas the Soviets believed it was fundamental and important deals they were involved in that Carter was now welching on. And so as he develops this new view of how the Soviets think about weapons, he basically has to undo the entire arms control policy and entire nuclear policy of his administration and reorients it into probably, with the possible exception of Ronald Reagan, possibly the toughest nuclear policy by 1979 that the United States has throughout the Cold War. So those are a couple of examples, I think, of sort of what came out of the research when I did it.
In doing your research, what, you know, from my perspective, reading your research, there are surprising findings littered throughout the book as well as earlier articles that you've read. But what surprised you the most in reading about the Carter administration's reversal or seeing of the light in the development of the countervailing strategy, or in other administrations, the way that they approach competition with the Soviet Union? What was most surprising?
I guess I would point to two things, which is in the earlier period, I was shocked at how much technical detail top American leaders actually got into, right? Which is, you have to understand, right? A president has to make 18 decisions every day, right? He has political functions, he has policy functions. You're basically shoving into him a room, you're giving him pieces of paper, right? I spend all day thinking about nuclear weapons. Presidents spend a small fraction of every week thinking about nuclear weapons, even during the Cold War. But Richard Nixon and Kissinger and his defense secretaries, they would get into these debates about what was the technological trajectory, right? What could the United States expect to do? Where could the United States get advantage, right? And it was just sort of, it was very surprising to me that that much attention was actually focused on these issues, right? That to me is like, yes, we in the weeds analysts know this stuff, but no, American presidents cared about this stuff. And then the transformation under Carter, you know, I sort of knew, I have a number of friends who are kind of professional right-wingers, right? And so like I used to like to make fun of them by pointing out, you know, sort of how Ronald Reagan took a bunch of his policies from the last part of Jimmy Carter's administration, right? That's when the defense, you know, starts to shoot up, right? But, you know, of course, Jimmy Carter was a verboten bad word to the Reaganites. But so I knew that the policy changed, right? But what was interesting to me is that it was so linked to the intelligence situation, which is that, you know, Jimmy Carter starts off his administration basically ignoring his intelligence, right? Right before this is a famous episode in the history of American intelligence called the Team B episode, which is essentially, I'm going to speak sort of glibly here, but it's an attempt of right-wingers to put pressure on the CIA, right? Because they're unhappy with American foreign policy. And so Carter just regards this intelligence as kind of garbage, corrupted stuff when he comes into power. And it's sort of remarkable to me how he turns on that, right? When he's had some experience with things going differently than he expected, how he and his administration more broadly start to take this kind of reporting much more seriously, and how that shapes the rest of their diplomacy. Right? And you know, the 1978 in the Carter administration is this weird dance, which is that the U.S. has to take back a bunch of things it's promised in the SALT negotiations. And it has to change them because it turns out the weapons it thought it was going to get rid of, it's not interested in getting rid of anymore, or at least not yet, right? And so it's a kind of, you know, very convoluted story, and it gets embarrassing. Like one time in early 1978, the Soviets show up to accept an American proposal, and our negotiator has to like hang his head and come back and say, well, actually, you know, certain terms and conditions apply, offer only valid while supplies last, right? You know, we've changed our mind. We're not going to do it anymore. So that to me was really interesting.
We've talked a little bit about the role of the Soviets in shaping American attitudes about arms control and competition, but you also mentioned a little bit in your talk and more in the book the role of American allies.
Yeah.
And of course this is one of the thorniest problems of nuclear deterrence during the Cold War, is that the United States is not simply trying to deter the Soviets from attacking American territory. The American leaders are trying to make credible threats that they will sacrifice or put on the line American lives in defense of other countries.
Yeah.
So the alliance system poses, NATO poses a number of complications for U.S. strategy. So talk a little bit about alliance pressures and how that fed into this competition narrative that you identified.
No, it's a great point, and this is what a lot of the Cold War struggle is about, right? Which is that the NATO alliance system is not just a way of defending against the Soviet Union, but it's part of a political arrangement that keeps Western Europe under a certain kind of American political management. But there's a very difficult problem, and you highlighted it exactly right, and we call it the problem of extended deterrence, which is how do you promise to start a nuclear war for somebody else? Right, which is that if there's a war in Europe, I mean, I love Europe. I think Europe is terrific. I like the Europeans. But I don't like the Europeans, as my niece says, right? I'm not sure I'm willing to sacrifice a dozen American cities so that Europe can live in, you know, a non-communist system. You know, this is a tough question, right? How do you make that kind of promise? How do you get both the adversary to believe it, but how do you get your friends to believe it, right? Well, one of the ways you do that is you tell your allies, no, it's true. No one can win a nuclear war today. But we're working on the problem. We're working very hard. Look at all the new things we're doing, right? Maybe, and I don't know this for a fact, right? I'm just going to speculate. But maybe you ought to take a look at this report of a recent submarine trail, right? These weapons aren't as secure as you think. When the moment of truth comes, we're going to stand tall for you because we're not going to have to face the kind of choice you're worried about us facing, right? Now, I want to be perfectly clear, right? The United States never got to a position in the Cold War where it could have disarmed the Soviet Union. I don't even think we got to a position where we could have walked out of the big war. But we came close. And in fact, the major thing that stopped us was American domestic politics stopped the United States from building enough missiles to do it, right? So that's why the competition matters, right? Because even if you don't get to this point, right, where you could do it in a crisis, in the meantime, you got to live with your allies, right? You got to plan what you're up to. You got to make sure politics in Europe doesn't start going to crazy places. And this is a way to keep everybody calm and on side.
Did you find evidence that European leaders put direct pressure on their American counterparts to invest more in advanced technology, counterforce capable nuclear weapons?
There's some very technical issues here, but the short answer to that is the Europeans were most concerned about a certain type of nuclear weapon. So I can sense that while there are a number of young people in the room, some of you may have remember the 1980s, right? And that in the 1980s, if you think back, right, in your salad days, right, there was this huge controversy called the Euro missile controversy, right, which is that the United States deployed nuclear weapons to Europe that were of an intermediate range, right? They eventually became called intermediate nuclear forces, right? And the Europeans were really worried about these kinds of weapons. And there were a number of complicated reasons why. But when it came to those types of weapons, you saw lots of European push, right? I think they were happy and they were somewhat mollified by stuff that the Americans were doing at the strategic, big, long-range weapons level. But that's not where you saw the European energy directed, right? That's where we would come to them with answers, but that's not where they were focused, right? They were focused on these weapons that lived inside of Europe.
Now, the lessons of the Cold War, we're interested in the Cold War history for its own sake, but we're even more interested in what it tells us about U.S. policy today. And that's what I want to turn to now. The conventional wisdom, of course, in Washington is we are now back in an era of great power competition, that it's Russia and China, either together or apart, but both pitted in some rivalry sense against the United States. So you mentioned at the end that it's time to strap in, that there might be a renewed nuclear competition underway. Do you see the current U.S. investments in its nuclear arsenal and revisions to U.S. nuclear posture as part of that renewed competition? And what would tell you that, or what would you suggest as a measure to try to prevent or forestall competition with Russia and China in a nuclear domain?
So, yes, I believe that the new U.S. modernization program for its nuclear forces, which is still largely undefined, right? It's not clear to me how this is going to end up getting shaped at a number of levels. This is the beginning of that sort of behavior, right? And so I think we're at the beginning, right? There's a complicated path to be run here, and I think it could be more intense or less intense, but you don't spend $1 trillion on updating your nuclear force if you don't believe this is going to be a central part of political life going forward, right? To the extent that that doesn't look appetizing, and frankly, I find myself in an odd position with this book, which is that I don't particularly like the idea of doing this again, but I'm having a hard time seeing good ways out of it. But if you don't like that idea, to me, the number one most important thing that the United States could do has nothing to do with its weapons, right? It's the politics of how it handles these states, right? Which is that what we want to avoid is something like the Cold War, where two sides are squaring off against each other that see each other as mortal and existential threats, not only to the survival of each other's nations, but to the principles for which they stand, right? And that just gets the way decision makers think in this incredibly competitive place, right? Well, you want to think instead about most of the 19th century, right? Where there are lots of great powers in Europe, right? And they're sort of bloody-minded towards each other, right? They're not exactly filled with the spirit of peace, love, and harmony, right? But where there are real limits to the degree in which their interests are opposed to each other, and where, in certain circumstances, there can be shifting patterns of cooperation, right? And you get yourself in that kind of mindset, then suddenly you start seeing incentives to make the competition less intense, right? Which is that, part of the way that you shape your adversary, or strategic rival is maybe a better term, part of the way you shape their behavior is you say, oh, you don't like my military program? Oh, well, I'd be happy to curtail it. But we're going to need your cooperation in the South China Sea, right? We're going to need cooperation from you, right? And so as long as you haven't gotten to the point where essentially we're defining the world in zero-sum terms, which is basically what happened almost from the beginning of the Cold War, I think there's ways out of this competition, but they're political ways, right? So that's what I would suggest.
I'll ask one more question, and then we'll turn to the audience for Q&A. And that's a question not about the United States or the Soviet Union or Russia. And it's about other countries, maybe China included. And the question is sort of predicated on an assumption that you might agree with, but might not agree with, which is that this intense nuclear competition seems to be something that really was unique to the US and the Soviets during the Cold War. We haven't seen India and Pakistan engaged in this fierce and fast nuclear competition to build more warheads, to make their capabilities more technologically advanced at a dramatic pace. China, for many decades, has kept its nuclear arsenal comparatively small. What explains these other cases, and do you think that the restraint of countries like India, Pakistan, and China will continue into the future?
Well, so you raise a very good question, right? And you're totally correct that the superpower arms race looks like an outlier, and that lots of other states have managed to live a life that has nuclear weapons that doesn't involve this kind of clawing each other's eyes out in annual defense budgets for getting a better arsenal. I think part of what has to be understood is the geopolitical context of the Cold War, which is that at some level, because the superpowers are involved everywhere, especially in the later part of the Cold War, they put a lid on the need of other states, many of whom are not very economically developed, to throw enormous resources into this problem, right? Which is that if things look like they're starting to spiral bad in South Asia, you can count that the Soviet Union and the United States are going to have opinions about that, right? And so in some sense, the superpowers serve as a kind of substitute for the doctrines of other states. Now, that doesn't apply to everybody, and you're right. In the Cold War, the Chinese just look odd, right? Which is that the Chinese attitude basically throughout the Cold War is, mad is right. That's the best idea we've ever heard. We're going to build a handful of these because you got to have them to be a great power, right? But we're mostly going to ignore them, right? And we're going to go about our lives doing other things like starving our population and having ridiculous revolutions, right? And then eventually becoming a technological and capitalist behemoth. But that, though, has started to change, right? And it's interesting, which is that you went from the Chinese in the 1970s and 80s talking about, essentially minimum deterrence, right? You just need enough to get one to land on somebody's state. To, we better have a lot that can survive, right? They're not at the space where they're thinking like the US and the Soviet Union were thinking about how to go after each other, but their threshold for what you need has been rising, right? And if you look at actually what the Chinese have said about it and what they've done, China watchers are correct that they don't think like the United States does. But what they've said and what they've done is inconsistent, right? They've done much more than they've said is necessary. I think right now, if you look at India and Pakistan, there was a very recent article published in the journal International Security about how the Indians are starting to take their cues from the American technological counterforce competition. And this is a country, by the way, that pledges it will never use nuclear weapons first. But it's investing in some really interesting capabilities for a country that's never going to use these weapons first. Now, I don't know how this will go, but my sense is that in a world where two superpowers are no longer serving as a kind of natural lid, where a lot of these countries have grown a lot richer, and where we might see political competition becoming more fierce, I think we could see more nuclear competition. I sort of worry that that's what's going to happen.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there are many pressing questions lingering out here in the audience. We have microphones coming around. The only request I would make of you is make sure your questions end in a question mark. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. One of the branches we held on to, as it were, coming down the cliff in the Cold War, was that a lot was going on we didn't know about, military to military. Conversation among sensible, reasonable people on both sides in the Cold War standoff. In fact, I worked for a foundation that supported mill-to-mill exchange and so on. Is that, to what extent, you mentioned that things have gone downhill greatly in the last decade for reasons that are perhaps difficult to understand. Kissinger says that demonization of Putin is not a substitute for policy, but it seems to drive our view everything toward Russia these days. Do we have any sense of what now is going on under the surface? Is there still that level of engagement that just seems so vital when the politics of it are bad?
I think that there's still reasonably robust mill-to-mill engagement with the Russians, in part because of arms control treaties, and in fact the ones that were signed after the Cold War, right? That's just resulted in a lot of periodic contacts between the two militaries, and as you point out, I think that is all to the good. I'm much less clear about what's going on with the Chinese. And in fact, my experience with the Chinese is that they tend to be very prickly about talking about these things, right? And they are really worried about showing too much of their hand to the Americans. But I don't actually have any personal knowledge in that area. It's just that I hear about American military officers that talk to their Russian counterparts. I don't hear of that story about China.
Yes.
Do any of the nuclear powers have the ability to hack into the systems of their strategic enemies? And if so, is that a very destabilizing development?
I couldn't tell you whether anyone can do it now. It is certainly a destabilizing development should it happen. And there was a period in the 1980s when the United States could basically do this to the Soviet Union, which is that we now know, I want to speak with some hesitation here, right, which is that what we know about this program is quite limited, and it comes from East German intelligence, right, that we recovered after the wall fell, right, which is that they had discovered an American program called Canopy Wing, which had essentially, for a time, been able to tap in and interfere with two very important Russian command and control systems for their nuclear forces, particularly their Signal M command and control system for their intercontinental ballistic missiles, and then the command and control system for their pretty small bomber force, but more importantly, their air defense forces, which were enormous and a very big part of Russian security. And at one time, apparently, the East Germans report that essentially the NATO could spoof the air defense system and act like they were a Russian pilot, right? And could basically mimic the sort of call and response that would get you through the air defenses, right? And when the Russians updated their ICBM command and control to something called Signal A, right? Shortly thereafter, right? Which makes me believe that they discovered the vulnerability and fixed it. It's the kind of thing that's happened before, I wouldn't be surprised if we were thinking about it now.
So has competition provided value in that there's been 75 years of great power peace?
Well, I think that's a question about nuclear weapons more generally, right? Which is that, I think that a good way to sort of, I have a view of nuclear weapons, which is these things are far less stabilizing than people think, right? But an excellent way to push back on me is say, well, gee, Brendan, that's really interesting. So these are not that stable. So where are all the nuclear wars, right? And yeah, you got a few crises you can mention, but look at the 19th century. Crises happen all the time in the 19th century, and that's a pretty peaceful century, by and large, right? We just don't even see that many crises in the Cold War past a certain point, right? Maybe that's because these weapons really have stability built into them. And there's really something about that I think is true. It just induces incredible caution in statesmen when they know that if something goes bad, that's it. We're toast. Everything that they value could be gone, right? That makes people behave very cautiously. I think that's true. I think it is almost certain that has contributed to the great era of great power peace that we've enjoyed for the past 75 years. My only counterpoint is that's not the only source of instability in international politics, right? And that military competition, even during peacetime, can be quite destabilizing. It can change the way that states look at each other. It can affect all kinds of different considerations that they have, right? But I agree with what you're saying. I think that is a real thing that nuclear weapons provide.
If I could build on that question just a little bit, this is, I think, at least among academics who study this issue, this is a conventional view that nuclear weapons tend to be stabilizing in one of these sort of paradoxes of the nuclear revolution. Up is down, more nuclear competition means less nuclear conflict. Is it possible that a focus on first strike capabilities and counterforce capable nuclear weapons enhance that sense of crisis anxiety that would make leaders less willing to get into a crisis and more cautious when they do get into crises?
Yeah, I think that's probably basically right. I think that when I pointed to the peacetime benefits, right, the sort of first benefit is the uncertainty it breeds in the mind of your adversary, right? And so, crazy stories being told in the 1980s, right? But at the same time, the crazier the story got, the more that all of the politicians would say, no. I mean, basically, there was the American war plan during the Cold War was known as the SIOP, or the Single Integrated Operational Plan. And whenever you became president, the first thing that happened to you is you got taken to the Pentagon, and they spent 2 hours walking you through the SIOP. And basically, every single president reacted the same way. We are never doing that. Get me another plan if you expect me to use these weapons, because that ain't happening, right? And so, yeah, the more you bring that to the front of decision makers' mind, the bizarre, bank shot arguments were made during the 1980s on exactly this point. It was so destabilizing, it was stabilizing, right? And this is the problem with nuclear weapons, which is they're prone to all this perversity of logic and thinking, and you can turn everything on its head, right? So yes is the short answer, and that mystery will be plumbed for many careers beyond mine. There were some over here I saw. Okay.
Mine's a quick one. Why do you pronounce the word nuclear?
I'm from Ohio, right? And this is one of my great shames, right? Which is that it's like I also mispronounce other words, but I apologize. It is nuclear, right? But I get excited and I revert back to my old sort of Midwestern roots. I'm like President George W. Bush, right? It's very embarrassing to me.
I have one question, which you probably not going to answer, but during the terminal phase of President Nixon's presidency, there were 3 members of the cabinet that agreed that if a signal was given to launch a nuclear strike against the Russians, that would not be executed unless these three individuals, I think one was the Secretary of Defense and two or three other people. Do we have such a program in place now to safeguard us against a nuclear strike?
I will just say that this is a famous story told about the height of the Watergate scandal, particularly during the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, which is Nixon is in the bag a lot of the time, right? He's really hammered. And Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger apparently has been reported, sends out the word that, if you get the order to launch, check with me first. I don't know how true that story is. I've never seen a document, and I've talked to people in the State Department Historical Office that say they've never seen a document like that. So it could be true, it could not be true. I'll just note two things, which is one, Secretary of Defense is not in the nuclear chain of command. Right? If that order gets given, it does not get given to the Secretary of Defense. Right? It gets sent to the National Military Command Center, where someone is ready to repeat back the code words and hear from the president if it's really the president. And that's the person who sends the order on. So the Secretary of Defense can say anything that they like to say. If the president picks up the phone and gets on the phone to the command center, he's got nothing to do with it, right? And further, I'll just say that that is the case today, and that at the end of the day, I probably regard that as a good thing. And it's an uncomfortable thing to say, especially with a president who some might say has behaved erratically. But I think what would be even worse is having to have a vote over whether to use nuclear weapons, right? The only point of having these things is to threaten to use them, right? And if it looks to somebody like there could be a way they might not get used, that's the opposite of what you're trying to convey. So I just think we have to live with a world where the president is the person who makes this decision, and if we're unhappy with the president who makes the decision, we could get another one.
You alluded to how political dealings might be sort of the light at the end of the tunnel in regards to this new nuclear, or this potential new nuclear conflict, or not conflict, but proliferation, arms race, yes. And I just wanted to know, in the sense that now the biggest difference is that instead of it being Russia and the US with China on the peripheral, now China is really in the center of this conflict. What is sort of the way the wind's blowing in terms of a potential US deal with one of these states, or a potential deal between one of these states against the US? And how does a scenario like that work?
What do you mean by a deal?
Well, I mean, in the sense that you alluded to, we might do this or that if you sort of tone down your behavior in the
kind
South
of
China
tacit
Sea.
bargaining.
Yeah.
Right. Right now, things are headed in a conflictual direction, in my opinion. Right, which is that the Pentagon is busy devoting all of its energies to the problem of China, right, and secondarily to Russia, but really to the problem of China, and the policy is in a kind of state of stasis right now in the White House, right? So I don't know what direction it's going to go in, but I don't see a lot of kind of sophisticated maneuvering, right? And I don't anticipate that kind of maneuvering in the next year or so, right? So I think things have been pointing in a bad direction since the Obama administration. Things have gotten a little bit better in some of the problem areas, but I don't see a bunch of kind of Bismarckian negotiation going on. I see people getting ready for Cold War II.
Very interesting, glad you came. Other than shared paranoia, all the money and research and storage of things, everybody's excited if a waste goes through their city because nuclear waste exists. What practical things came out of all of this? Something useful, like heating people's homes or climate change.
It's really interesting, right? Which is that if I get into my car, right, and I want to go somewhere, all I have to do is turn on my phone and it'll start directing me how to get there. Well, that's because of the GPS system. GPS system was a nuclear system. Actually, the most important thing that it does is it detects whether there's been a nuclear detonation on the Earth. Right? It's also how we started tracking things at really high levels of fidelity. We invented it first because we wanted to kill the Soviets. or thought we might have to, right? But now it means I don't have to know where anything is. My phone carries that information. I think that there have been a number of sort of really useful follow-on technologies, right? Which is that right now and post the Cold War, the United States developed this incredible military capability to see where things are and to potentially hit them with lots of high explosive very quickly, right? But that same technology can look inside me and see that, I have cancer, right? Or that's what's wrong with my third lower lumbar. I don't think that this is really a good reason to engage in military competition. But nevertheless, I do think that some things came out of it that most people would consider positive.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Congratulations on the book. I was struck at what you said about Jimmy Carter, and from the standpoint of this question about nuclear learning. Do presidents learn on the job? And your statement about how little time they have rings true, and it's quite startling when you think about it. But anyway, given that they have little time, but given that they have enormous responsibility on their shoulders and reasons to focus on the problem and reasons to surround themselves with people who know what they're doing and so on, I wonder what you see in the 70s about learning, or from your knowledge of other decades, and the application to this question, I hope, is clear. The man in the White House now, we like to think, is capable of learning, particularly on this topic, but it's not at all clear that he is. So I'm just wondering what you have to say about learning how these weapons, either that they are more or less useful than the president thought when he came into office.
Yeah, it's a very difficult and important question, but it's a difficult one to get a hold of, right? In part for the reasons you mentioned, which is that to really figure this out, what you'd want is a really clear set of data, which is the president believed X thing at this time, and then at this time he believed Y, and we can trace the process of how his belief changed, right? Or we can at least make some inferences. And it's just, you don't usually have that level of fidelity, right? Even in the way that I've cast things here, right? Like I've talked about it as though the president that I know, I've got cameras on him assiduously reading national intelligence estimates reports. No, I just know what showed up on his desk. I know that he started to change, right? I know that he got memos saying, you should really look at this, Mr. President, right? And he initialed them, right? And would often write marginalia about them, about, the perfidy of the Soviets and those cheating people, right? And why aren't they, signing up to my brilliant plan? So I'm drawing inferences from that. And so I guess the best that I would say is that, presidents in foreign policy have 2 or 3 initiatives that they really care about. And I think that where learning occurs is that you're trying to do something you really care about and you get an unexpected response, right? And it doesn't, and you wanted to do this and the world is not conforming to your expectations. And then that's when you learn something. And what you learn depends on what the world spat back at you and what alternatives you think you have. So as far as this president's concerned, I actually hope that there's no learning he undergoes, because that would imply that there was a big thing where he expected something different than what he got. And I just assumed that with any president, right? I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I just assumed that any president not have that opportunity. But if they do have that opportunity, I hope they'll use it, and I hope this president will too.
Well, unfortunately, we are running short on time. Brendan, you are to be, I think, congratulated for not nibbling around the edges. There are, I think, maybe a couple of really big questions about nuclear weapons in the Cold War. One is why a nuclear war didn't happen, and the other is why nuclear competition was so fierce when all of our academic theories, and especially scholarship from the beginnings of the nuclear age, told us that it would never happen. And yet it happened anyway, and I think your book offers a very compelling and also somewhat unsettling answer to that question. So congratulations to you, and thank you for spending your time with us.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming.